Welcome back to the afternoon home stretch of Deaccessioning after 2020. As a reminder, live captioning is available for this segment. The button for that is at the bottom of your screen. This session will be recorded for future viewing, but given the short time frame for this segment, we won't be taking questions. I'm pleased to introduce our final keynote speaker. Christopher Bedford is the Dorothy Wagner Wallace Director of the Baltimore Museum of Art, renowned for its collections of 19th century, modern, and contemporary art. Bedford previously served as director of the Rose Art Museum at Brandeis University and as the U.S. Pavilion Commissioner for the 2017 Venice Biennale. He has held curatorial positions at the Wexner Center for the Arts at The Ohio State University, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and the J. Paul Getty Museum. Bedford has a BA from Oberlin College and an MA from Case Western University, and he studied in the doctoral programs at the University of Southern California and the Courtauld Institute of Art. Chris, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for having me. I'm going to dive quickly in. I know we have limited time. So I want to begin by thanking the organizers of this extraordinary symposium, as well as my inspiring fellow speakers, particularly the artists who are and will remain the wind beneath our sails. Yesterday's session, led by the inimitable Carrie Mae Weems, was an inspiration. I felt a deep kinship with each of the speakers, and I hope that at least some of them are present to endure my comments today. Artists and artist-led not-for-profits have been and remain the impetus for the work we do at the BMA, so it was deeply gratifying for me to hear those voices set the tone for this great symposium. So with that said, I'll launch in. Although a critical analysis of the structure and function of art museums is decades overdue, this imperative has been thrown into high relief in the past 18 months by artists, activists, museum staff, and cultural critics. These voices have pointed to inequities and biases rooted in gender, race, and class-based discrimination within all aspects of museum operations, including exhibitions, acquisitions, public programs, staff, board, vendor selection, and investment strategy. And they are calling for an immediate reckoning and consequent steps towards sustainable change. As museum leadership engage in necessary examinations of their institutions, it is crucial to consider what role a museum's collection should play in driving a change agenda. This talk will examine the Baltimore Museum of Art's experience with deaccessioning and collection development in the context of a broader institution-wide culture shift as a provocation to consider how collections might be deployed to advance mission and bring about much overdue structural change. As museums announce their commitments to diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, we must also look closely at the ways in which we continue to fall short of these goals and examine all of the possible avenues to bring about the just and relevant future that I think we all imagine for museums in the 21st century. Though it is my position that the just demands, among them fair compensation, leadership accountability, etc., are being advanced by loosely affiliated activist groups should continue to drive the art world news cycle and us as leaders towards radical change, there is little doubt that deaccessioning has become the most hotly contested subject in the art world. With the relationship of a museum's collection to the realization of its mission being deeply fundamental to the roughly 3 positions that define the spectrum of this debate. I'd like to take just 2 minutes to sketch those positions. For some, let's say those on the most traditional end of this debate, a museum's first and most sacred responsibility is to the objects in its care. A museum is defined by its collection, and no consideration should prevail over this first charge. In the most extreme cases, the folks in this camp disagree with deaccessioning, period. If a curator or director at a certain moment in history saw the merit in adding this object to the collection, surely it is the case that at a future point in history that we can't yet foretell, an unnamed successor will see comparable merit or interest, only to find that the object has been sold. Others of this inclination might support careful and deliberative deaccessioning, but only and very strictly for the purpose of buying art. Otherwise, Pandora's box has been opened, cannot be closed, and we are on the slippery slope to the dissolution of Western museum culture as we know it. This perspective is further guided by the notion, and in some instances fear, that changes to deaccessioning policy will result in the loss of public trust, donor dollars, and trustee support. This position is at best speculative and at worst alarmist, in my opinion. The BMA has very publicly tested these waters, and there was no such outcome. A moderate position, and one clearly articulated by some of the leaders in our field, Glenn Lowry of MoMA among them, is that museums have too much art in storage and not enough money to effectively realize their missions and provide maximum access and service to their communities. Thusly, museums should be given the agency to sell works of art routinely, both for the reasons of collection development and with clearly defined limits and protocols in place to, for instance, provide for the costs associated with the direct care of collection. This then would alleviate some pressure on the annual operating budget, providing museums with the latitude to advance mission, however that is defined, more aggressively. For those in the most conservative camp, this moderate position begins the aforementioned slippery slope and should not therefore be entertained as a policy for our field. Finally, there are those of us in the most progressive end of the spectrum who begin with the assumption that the most important thing a museum can nurture is in fact not its collection, but rather its community, which includes its staff. Put differently, museums exist to serve their collections only insofar as those collections serve the needs and interests of their communities in the broadest and most diverse definition. Museums are community resources, they are not membership clubs. Therefore, in order to reach and serve all communities, not just those in historically established spaces of privilege, it is an imperative of the present to reckon with the inequities of the past and the institutional systems that uphold those inequities. No aspect of these systems should be exempt from that analysis. So then it follows that collections and the policies that govern their maintenance must be subjected to the same value-based scrutiny. If the barriers to equity, at least those most frequently cited, are dominantly monetary, and if collections constitute our category of greatest accrued value, how can we responsibly permit museums to use those illiquid assets to fulfill their missions in the future? The central imperatives of relevance and access very rarely, if ever, make an appearance in deaccessioning debates. Why not center those imperatives and let them drive our deaccessioning discussions towards a policy that will enable us to achieve a more just future? With those broad framing comments in place, let me just say this. I'm well aware of why I was invited to give this talk, and I want to meet that obligation by being frank and unvarnished in the delivery of my opinion on this subject, which admittedly flies in the face of precedent quite deliberately and of the habits that constitute standard thinking and practice in the museum field. But I think it's crucial in the spirit of open collegial discourse for the full spectrum of opinions on this subject to be given space, not necessarily so that an extreme prevails, so either extreme, but so the standard we elect as a discipline to abide by does not rest on the unanalyzed, unpressured tyrannies of history and habit. I think we are much better than that as a field. It is far easier to uphold centuries-old ways of thinking with gusto and vitriol than it is to propose something new. This has been how it's always done argument is tried and true and still goes a long way. Another adage that I'd like to cite is, if it isn't broken, don't fix it. Well, I think we can all concede at this point that our museums in their current incarnation are at least partially broken. So I think it behooves us to at least entertain other futures for the good of our publics and for the good of the field. So one of the many barbs thrown my way in the press and otherwise, and I'm grateful for all of them, really does fuel the fire, goes something like this. Well, of course, we admire your work and your ambitions and the moral basis of your vision for the BMA, but why do you have to sell art to achieve all of that? So however this position is posed to me, the but clause is where I and the person posing the question part company. Of course, we believe in diversity, but. Of course, we believe in equity, but. Of course, we believe in fair compensation, but. And of course, your goals are laudable, but. One of the chief questions I want to pose with proper respect and humility is why shouldn't we sell out to achieve these most pressing and indeed laudable goals? That provocation is my primary subject today. In 2018, under the leadership of Jim Thornton, the vice chair of our board of trustees and chair-elect beginning in July 2022, we adopted a new mission and vision statement for the BMA. The mission statement reads as follows. The Baltimore Museum of Art connects art to Baltimore and Baltimore to the world, embodying a commitment to artistic excellence and social equity in every decision, from art presentation, interpretation, and collecting, to the composition of our board of trustees, staff, and volunteers, creating a museum welcoming to all. The crucial linchpin here is the application of this philosophy across all categories of activity. In practice, this means exhibitions, acquisitions, public programs, board, staff, vendor selection, and investment decisions. On the subject of collection development and deaccessioning specifically, we took swift action in service of this mission. In late 2018, we sold 7 works of art from our permanent collection. We earned $16.2 million from the public auction and private sales of these 7 works by Franz Klein, Kenneth Nolan, Jules Zalitsky, Robert Rauschenberg, and Andy Warhol to support the acquisition of works by female identifying artists and artists of color. The 2 works by Andy Warhol arrived at the BMA through the shared generosity of the Andy Warhol Foundation and the Pearlstone Family Foundation in 1994. In agreeing to support our plan to deaccession these 2 works, the Pearlstone Family Foundation stipulated that rather than create an endowment with the proceeds from sale, we instead create a fund that could be spent down to create immediate impact on the stories our collection can tell. In the past 3 years, we have been acquiring works in alignment with this mandate, and in the process addressing glaring gaps in our collection while simultaneously charting new and exciting future directions. So far, we have acquired 95 works by 82 artists, with outstanding examples by Isaac Julian, Wengechi Mutu, Amy Sherald, Carrie Mae Weems, Jack Whitten, Mary Lovelace O'Neill, among many others. More than half are completely new to our collection. It is important to remember that this action, while more and more common today, and justly so, caused a predictable outcry in 2018 when announced. Not dissimilar, in fact, to our decision to acquire works only by female identifying artists in 2020 in recognition of the advent of white women's suffrage in the United States. In this instance, we spent $2.57 million from a variety of funding sources to add 65 works to the collection by 49 female identifying artists, including 40 who had not previously been represented at the museum. While this doesn't come close to rectifying the decades of imbalance represented by only 4% of named women artists in our collection, we are installing these and other works as quickly as we can so that the narrative of art history shown on our gallery walls itself begins to shift. One criticism we heard was that both of these decisions were simple publicity stunts. So to that, I would say, sure, yes, that's true. They were calculated decisions, telegraphed aggressively, that were intended to raise awareness and catalyze debate in the field and in the mainstream too. And I think I can say unequivocally that we were successful in both cases. So both of these initiatives have borne extraordinary fruit, as current and forthcoming collection-based exhibitions will attest, launching the BMA with vigor in the right direction. But our successful work in this category is a very small part of the realization of the full mission for the BMA. The vital move for art museums in the 21st century is away from a primary focus on creative program towards what I would call a sustainable set of policies, precisely symmetrical with our creative artistic values. So as to shorthand that from program to a focus on policy. Stated very succinctly, it is not enough for museums, the BMA included, to live their missions only on our walls, in our vaults, or when we mount a public program. The central imperative is to model the world within our walls as demanded by the artists at the leading edge of our program, and to provide maximum access to that world for the greatest number of people, irrespective of their means. To that end, to move then from a condition of simple illustration to a condition of wholly integrated institution, grounded in values and driven by them too. For any museum that aspires to take on this kind of ambitious DEAI work, one must first reckon with the past with very clear eyes. So in the spirit of this case study, I want to offer a few statistics about Baltimore and the Baltimore Museum of Art in no particular order. Baltimore is a 64% Black city. In 2016, when I arrived at the museum, our audience was 72% white. Our permanent collection is 96% male. In our 107-year history, there has never been a Black chair of our board. When I arrived at the BMA, there was not a single curator of color. In 2016, the Board of Trustees was 82% white. In 1939, the BMA mounted the first group exhibition of work by African Americans in an American museum, and we acquired not a single work from that show. In our 107-year history, we have never mounted a ticketed monographic exhibition with an accompanying catalog focused on a woman artist. And until 2017, there had never been a person of color that was a member of the BMA's senior leadership team. I could cite all the progress we've made in all of the categories I just stated, just as I could go on pointing out the structural deficiencies of our own history, but that is not the point here. The point is to reckon with the systemic nature of bias in our history as the basis for action beginning now in all categories and using all means. A dominantly white-centered museum with all the attendant systems of prejudice, conscious and otherwise, cannot achieve this goal, not now and not ever. So we had to change quickly to achieve the goals that we'd set out for ourselves. Enacting this philosophy in practice necessitates, in my view, acknowledging the fundamental difference between equity and equality. Equality, simply stated, is what we are striving for. But that condition is not achieved by simply being fair in the present. Equality is achieved in the future by reckoning with one's past in the present and moving with speed and determination to address the biases of that past. I do not believe that this process can be achieved through a methodology of pure addition. Our methods have to be compensatory and they have to be reparatory. To apply this to collecting for a minute, I believe very simply that we should take into account the prejudices of the past and distort our collection development efforts accordingly to structure a new canon, one that describes the diverse and inclusive art history as it actually unfolded. Not the one, for instance, described in standard survey texts like the much used Art Since 1960. This book was first published in 2004, and it mentions around 800 artists by name, 24 of whom are African American, or about 3%. And the timeline narrating major moments in the history of art in the 20th century that introduces this canonical book features 110 artists, of which one, Fred Wilson, is Black. For an account that is not only equitable but true, you cannot simply plug in a few Black artists from the past 10 years. You have to rewrite the entire story. These sexist, racist, and simply inadequate histories do not represent the truth of the past and should be summarily dismantled beginning yesterday. Again, I could go on, but there's all of this lived experience and accrued data that led the BMA to its decision in 2020 to deaccession 3 paintings from our permanent collection. It's not my intention here to mire this presentation by relitigating object selection, but I will reiterate the objects chosen, the anticipated revenue from sale, and the objectives that we would have achieved had we moved forward in service of structural change in this manner. The works were Andy Warhol's Last Supper from 1986, Bryce Marden's 3, 1987, and Clifford Still's 1947 G from 1947. The expected yield from sale was approximately 65 million, with 10 million of which would have been allocated to the acquisition of post-war work by men and women of color, with the remaining 55 million being deployed as follows. 39.5 would have gone towards pay equity and market salary adjustments. The primary priority of our effort was to secure and in most cases increased staff salaries to meet competitive market rates. Every staff position, starting with entry-level and hourly employees, was evaluated through the lens of pay equity, with increases of 3% to 48% rolling out incrementally throughout the museum. This includes individuals in front of house positions, such as security and visitor services staff, as well as roles across curatorial, conservation, installation, education, marketing, advancement facilities, and administration. We would have channeled $3 million in total towards our DEAI programs. This would have gone towards the creation and implementation of a comprehensive institutional plan for internal and external diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion initiatives. This work plan currently underway is being developed by a staff-led DEAI task force drawn from across the institution with the assistance of industry-recognized consultants in the areas of racial and gender equity, disability, indigeneity in the cultural sphere, and Janetta Cole, the museum special counsel for strategic initiatives, is lending a hand here too. While the BMA made the bold decision to eliminate its general admission fee in 2006, we still charge for changing exhibitions. So our intent was to allocate $9.5 million to an endowment to expand our effort to reach a broader audience and encourage new engagement with the institution by eliminating all admission fees for special exhibitions. By reducing the financial burden of museum visitation, the BMA aims to remove the substantial barrier to entry, allowing visitors to experience the full range of our museum's presentations. In our view, $12, $17.50, or $25 per person is simply untenable to the vast majority. Finally, extended hours. This would have been an allocation of $3 million. To truly be a museum of and for the city of Baltimore, the BMA must consider those residents who may or may not work traditional schedules and ensure that these audiences have opportunities to visit and experience our collections, exhibitions, and public programs. Thanks to spend down funding from the Rouse Company Foundation, when we are able to fully reopen, the museum will extend its evening hours to 9 p.m. 1 day per week. This builds on prior efforts, such as opening the BMA's secondary space at Lexington Market to meet its community's need for regular and consistent access to our creative program. As these various moves very clearly attest, the BMA believes unequivocally that museums exist to serve their communities through experiences with art and artists. We believe that museums and their collections have been built on structures that we must work through bold and tangible action to reckon with, modify, and reimagine as structures that will meet the demands of the future. We believe that this effort is not about sacrificing history, but about telling a more accurate and complete narrative of art, culture, and people. We do not abide by notions that museums exist to serve objects. We believe the objects in our collection must reflect, engage, and inspire the many different individuals that we serve. The goals outlined above remain our goals, and I'm confident that they'll be achieved, with progress already made thanks to the support of extraordinary donors Eileen Harris Norton and Jeffrey and Harriet Legum, in addition to support from the Rouse Company Foundation. It is important that we reckon with the structural truth of our museums, and the collection is no exception to this mandate. Like the museum as a whole, it is highly white-centered, and it is the repository of great value. It is, in fact, the most literal manifestation of the systems of prejudice and privilege upon which Western museums have been constructed. It is not enough to look everywhere other than the collection to identify a means of repair to this condition. While we elected not to sell the 3 paintings in question in order to remain compliant with AAMD's guidelines, I do not concede that those guidelines should go unchallenged and unquestioned as the best possible standards to advance the cause of museums in the 21st century. Art history itself is a story of recognition and rupture. By that I mean, we valorize artists who recognize all that came before them and blow a hole in that history to make a new space for themselves. The future we imagine for our museums will not be achieved with the urgency necessary if we move at the plodding pace dictated by unchallenged habits. We need to find a responsible way to create the rupture necessary to jolt our museums into a new space of relevance. If the methods we at the BMA propose to employ are not precisely those methods applicable to the field, I think that's fine. But I will say this: anti-racist readings and collection diversification alone will not bring about the kinds of sustainable structural changes needed. Real change involves actual sacrifice, and we need to agree together on a method to achieve just that, just and proportional sacrifice. The real threat to museums is not deaccessioning, but continuing to lose relevance because we are not responding to this moment, our moment in history, and embracing our communities properly. We need to look with clear eyes at all the means and all the assets at our disposal and ask ourselves what we're willing to do and what we're willing to give to become the museums our communities deserve. This is not too much to ask, in my view, far from it, in fact. So when the question is posed, why sell some art to achieve these goals? Again, I would say, why not? Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Chris, for those thought-provoking words, and we appreciate you being here with us this afternoon. Up next, we'll be discussing progressive deaccessioning in the next panel, and after that, our final session, where heads of leading institutions from around the country will discuss whether change is necessary. And Chris, we'll see you back for that one. In the meantime, we hope to see you very shortly in the next session. Thank you.